We're going to look at how the exchange rate can affect living standards in this lecture. Now, we know the exchange rate is how much the Australian dollar can buy of other currencies. So how much the dollar is worth in terms of another currency. And this has a very direct correlation with our material living standards. So we're going to assume, for the purpose of this lecture, that the exchange rate has a direct effect on material living standards, but a very indirect effect on non-material living standards. And because this effect on non-material living standards is very indirect, we're not going to worry about this. The effect on non-material living standards. We're just going to worry about the effect on material living standards, and therefore, by extension, living standards as a whole. Okay, so what are the classes of economic agents who are affected by the exchange rate? So we're going to break these down into three main types of people. So we have consumers, exporters, and importers. They're the three main classes of economic agents that are directly affected by changes in the exchange rate. Okay, so what do consumers want with the exchange rate? So consumers import, and I must note at the moment, right now, that consumers are different from importers, because importers, we're going to assume that they sell the imported product. So they're not consuming the imported product, they're selling the imported product in another market. And so they require the exchange rate to be relatively low, or relatively high, I should say. And we'll talk about that later. But now let's focus on consumers. What do they want in an exchange rate? So I'm assuming that you guys have all bought something overseas from eBay or from shops online that require you to exchange the Australian dollar for another currency. So let's just say we're going to a clothes store, say Tommy Hilfiger, USA. They don't want the Australian dollar, they want the US dollar. And so let's say a shirt costs $50 USD. And let's say, for simplicity, and we know, of course, this is not the case, that 1 AUD buys 2 USD. Okay, so at the moment we have that as the exchange rate. So we know that 1 AUD buys 2 USD, and therefore the cost of this shirt at the moment is only 25 AUD. And as we know, we can't really buy Tommy Hilfiger shirts in Australia for $25. So consumers are better off in this case because we have such a high exchange rate. But let's say this depreciates to 1 AUD buys only 1 USD. So the cost of this shirt here would actually be 50 Australian dollars, which is the same as the 50 US dollars there. So when the exchange rate depreciates, consumers are worse off. So we're going to see when the exchange rate depreciates, consumers are worse off because their money is worth less in the international market, and so their purchasing power decreases. And as we know, we're going to note that PP decreases. So as we know, purchasing power has a direct correlation with our material living standards, because our material living standards are correlated to how many goods and services, or how many needs and wants we can satisfy. And if the purchasing power decreases, then we can satisfy fewer needs and wants with the available money that we have. So in this case, we could have bought 2 shirts with the exchange rate at 1 to 2, but we can only buy 1 shirt at the exchange rate 1 to 1. So consumers, they want, I'm going to put this in a light blue, they want the exchange rate to go up. So consumers will experience an increase in living standards when the exchange rate is very high. Now let's look at exporters. Exporters, they want to maximize profits, right? Maximize profits because they want a higher income. So profit is directly related to income. How they increase profits? They need to sell their product. So if we take the example, if we just move across here, if we take the example of a wheat producer. So the wheat producer in Australia is selling for 10 AUD a kilo. And the wheat producer, this is Australia, and the wheat producer in New Zealand sells it at 20 New Zealand dollars a kilo. So let's just assume, again for simplicity, obviously the exchange rate between Australia and New Zealand is around 1 to 1.2. But let's assume for simplicity that the exchange rate is 1 AUD to 1.5 New Zealand dollars. So if we convert this Australia dollars in kilos to New Zealand, it'd actually be around 15 New Zealand dollars a kilo. So again, if someone from New Zealand wanted to purchase wheat, let's just call this wheat here, wheat. If someone wanted to purchase wheat, they wouldn't buy it domestically because they'd forego an extra $5 in New Zealand dollars to purchase wheat. What they want is to purchase Australian wheat because it is only they only need to forego 15 New Zealand dollars as opposed to 20 New Zealand dollars a kilo if they purchase domestically. So now let's look at the example when the Australian dollar appreciates. So the Australian dollar appreciates to 1 AUD to around 3 New Zealand dollars. So this is almost doubled, and in reality it doesn't really happen like that because the RBA will take measures to keep the Australian dollar stable. And as we know, part of the goal of external stability is to have a stable currency so that exporters and importers can predict or help predict with relative certainty the future and to use costs and to use their costs more wisely to affect future spending so that their profits are sort of kept in the relative ballpark range of what they need to survive. So now we can see if the Australian dollar appreciates from 1 to 1.5 to 1 to 3, we can see that the same batch of wheat would cost 30 New Zealand dollars per kilo, and that's simply done by multiplying 10 here by 3. So now, as we can see, when the Australian dollar appreciates, or the exchange rate appreciates, then exporters would be worse off in their living standards because New Zealand residents wouldn't buy wheat from Australia anymore because it's a lot more expensive since they need to convert New Zealand dollars to Australian dollars first before purchasing or importing. So now we can see that exporters want the exchange rate to go down. So they want this to be as low as possible so they can maximize their profits. Now finally, let's look at importers. So importers buy goods overseas and they sell it here. So a very pertinent example of this is cars. Manufacturers or dealers, they purchase cars from overseas and then they sell it domestically. But what causes this is what causes people to enter the import market is because sometimes international goods are more competitive relative to Australian goods. And this can be the case of cars because of higher labour costs in Australia. So what do importers want? They also want to maximize profits. And so when they maximize profits, they want to maximize sales. So that's strongly correlated. Sales and profits. So what do consumers want to maximize their living standards? Is to lower costs, lower the sales price. And if we look at the same example from a New Zealand point of view, Importers, if there is a similar wheat importer, so they purchase wheat from Australia and then sell it domestically in New Zealand. When the exchange rate is very, very high, then by importing New Zealand, so if we're looking at the exchange rate for New Zealand, this is relatively high and this is low for New Zealand. So not to get confused with this, so this is a high exchange rate from New Zealand's point of view. So they want this. So here, exporters, or importers I should say, would purchase wheat at 15 New Zealand dollars a kilo. And so in New Zealand, importers would benefit when the exchange rate is high. So they can purchase more goods and services with the same amount of money than if the exchange rate was low. In this case, only 3 New Zealand dollars would buy 1 Australian dollar. Then importers would not benefit because it would cost 30 New Zealand dollars per kilo of wheat as opposed to domestically produced 20 New Zealand dollars per kilo. So people wouldn't buy from the importers, they would actually buy from the domestic producers. And as such, importers want the exchange rate to be high. So what we can see here, there's definitely a trade-off between exporters and importers as well as consumers. So consumers want the exchange rate to be high because their purchasing power increases. When the exchange rate decreases, their purchasing power decreases. And by the same token, exporters will experience a higher purchasing power or better competitiveness if the exchange rate of the country is very low, so that they are more internationally competitive. But on the other hand, importers will experience a decline in profits and living standards when the exchange rate is very, very low. So importers want the exchange rate to be high, exporters want the exchange rate to be low, and consumers want the exchange rate to be high. And that is how the exchange rate can affect living standards of these 3 major parties involved with the trade of the currency in the international market.